The unexpected encounter, the corner table at Luminaire, had always been Delilah Brooks's favorite spot. Tucked away near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, it offered just enough privacy for her to work without feeling completely isolated from the world. She sat with her laptop open, her third cup of coffee growing cold beside a half-eaten croissant. Reviewing the digital mock-ups for her latest project at 34, Delilah had learned to find comfort in small rituals. The Tuesday lunch at Luminaire was one of them. It wasn't extravagant. The coffee was good, the pastries were fresh, and the ambient noise provided just enough white noise to help her focus. After the divorce 2 years ago, these moments of peaceful solitude had become sacred. She was adjusting the color palette on her screen when she heard it. That laugh. The one she'd heard echo through their apartment for 6 years. The one that used to make her smile but had eventually become a sound that preceded criticism and contempt. Delilah's fingers froze over the keyboard. The grand entrance Preston Walsh entered. Luminaire, like he owned it. His charcoal suit was clearly bespoke, probably Brion, and his Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor with an almost musical precision. His hair was styled perfectly, not a strand out of place. And his Patek Philippe watch caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Attached to his arm was Amber Kelsey, his new wife. She was everything a certain type of man dreamed about. Blonde hair that cascaded in perfect waves, a figure maintained by personal trainers and careful diets, and an outfit that screamed designer labels. Her white sundress probably cost more than Delilah's monthly rent, and her oversized sunglasses were perched on her head like a crown. Delilah instinctively looked down at her own outfit. Dark jeans, a simple black turtleneck, and the comfortable flats she'd owned for 3 years. She'd dressed for a day of work, not for running into her past. Oh my God. Amber's voice carried across the restaurant, pitched high with manufactured surprise. Preston, isn't that your ex-wife? Several heads turned. Delilah felt her cheeks flush. But she forced herself to look up and meet Preston's gaze directly. The performance. Preston's smile was sharp and predatory. He changed course immediately, steering Amber toward Delilah's table with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the power in the room. Delilah, he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. What a surprise. I didn't know you could still afford places like this. The jab was immediate and intentional. Delilah closed her laptop slowly, buying herself a moment to breathe. Hello, Preston. Amber. It's so great to see you, Amber gushed, though her eyes were cold and assessing. You look so comfortable. That's really important after everything you've been through. Comfortable. The word hung in the air like an insult disguised as a compliment. Delilah recognized it for what it was. She looked comfortable compared to Amber's carefully constructed glamour. She looked like someone who had given up. Preston pulled out a chair without being invited and sat down. Amber remained standing, one hand on her hip, surveying the restaurant as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to. So, Preston said, leaning back in the chair with casual arrogance. Still doing the art thing? What are you working on? More of those little paintings? Little paintings. Delilah had spent 5 years creating a series of mixed media pieces that had been featured in 3 galleries. Preston had always called them little paintings, as if the size of the canvas determined the worth of the work. I'm doing digital installations now, Delilah said evenly. It's a different medium. Digital, Preston repeated, his tone suggesting she'd just told him she was making crafts for a church bazaar. Right, that's nice. A hobby's important. Keeps you busy. The cruelty deepens. Amber finally sat down, crossing her legs and examining her manicure. Preston's been doing incredibly well, she announced to no one in particular. Senior partner at the firm. Youngest in the company's history? Congratulations, Delilah said quietly. We just got back from Santorini, Amber continued, warming to her subject. Our villa had an infinity pool that overlooked the caldera. Have you ever been to Greece, Delilah? The question was designed to highlight the contrast between their lives. Delilah and Preston had talked about going to Greece during their marriage, but they'd never been able to afford it. Now, he was taking Amber to private villas, though Delilah admitted, not yet. You should go sometime, Amber said, with exaggerated sympathy. maybe save up for it. I hear the hostels, they're supposed to be really clean. Preston laughed, a short bark of amusement. The sound made Delilah's stomach turn. We're actually headed to the Hamptons this weekend, Preston said, signaling the waiter for champagne without asking if the women wanted any. Big yacht party? Networking event. Really. Some of the biggest names in finance and law will be there. It's invitation only, of course. You let that last detail hang in the air. Invitation only. Not for people like Delilah. Not for people who worked on laptops in coffee shops in war. 3-year-old flats. The final insult, the champagne arrived. Preston ordered a bottle of Dom Perignon without looking at the price. When the waiter poured 3 glasses, Delilah didn't touch hers. You know, Preston said, swirling his champagne thoughtfully, I've been thinking about you lately. Feeling a little guilty, honestly. Delilah raised an eyebrow. Preston feeling guilty was about as likely as snow in July. The divorce was hard on you, he continued, his voice taking on a tone of exaggerated concern. I can see that. And I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges about how bitter you were during the settlement. Bitter. She'd been bitter because he'd fought her on every single asset. Because his lawyers had buried her in paperwork. Because he'd made sure she walked away with as little as possible. I'm doing fine. Preston, Delilah said. Are you, though? He leaned forward, his eyes scanning her laptop, her coffee, her modest outfit, because it doesn't look like it. And I want to help. I really do. Amber was watching this exchange with barely concealed delight, like someone watching a particularly entertaining reality show. Diane, my secretary, is retiring next month, Preston said. We'll need someone to answer phones, file paperwork, that sort of thing. It's not glamorous, but it's steady. Pays decently. I could put in a word for you. The air left Delilah's lungs. He was offering her a secretarial position. At his firm, answering his phones. That's really generous, Amber added, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. Not everyone would help out their ex like this. You're lucky to have Preston looking out for you. Delilah felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't heartbreak. That had happened 2 years ago in a lawyer's office, surrounded by contracts and recriminations. This was something different. This was the final, definitive proof that Preston had never known her at all. He'd never understood her work, her passion, or her worth. To him, she'd always been an accessory, something to be managed and eventually discarded when a better option came along. Thank you for the offer, Delilah said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. But I'll pass. Preston shrugged, as if he'd expected this response. Suit yourself. But when things get really tough, you know where to find me. I'll mean it. No shame in asking for help. He stood up, leaving his champagne untouched. Amber rose with him, adjusting her dress and checking her reflection in the window. See you around, Delilah, Preston said. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to him, he added, or maybe not. We don't really travel in the same circles anymore, do we? They walked away, Amber's laughter tinkling behind them like breaking glass. Delilah sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the 3 glasses of champagne on her table. The other diners had already turned back to their meals. The brief entertainment over, she picked up her phone and opened her messages. At the top was a text from yesterday, from a contact labeled simply WB. Looking forward to seeing your new work this weekend. The Hamptons estate is ready. Your suite overlooks the water. Let me know if you need anything else. Delilah allowed herself a small, private smile. Then she closed her laptop, left cash on the table for her meal, and walked out of Luminaire without looking back. The real story was just beginning. The ashes of a marriage 2 years earlier, Delilah Brooks had stood in the empty apartment she'd once shared with Preston Walsh, surrounded by boxers and the ghost of a life she'd no longer recognized. The divorce had been finalized 3 days prior, and Preston had wasted no time. He'd already moved into his new penthouse with Amber. Leaving Delilah to pack up the remnants of their 6 years together, she'd found it in his study, buried in a drawer he thought she'd never open. A portfolio of design concepts, branding materials, and artistic renderings. Her designs, the mixed media pieces she'd created during their marriage. The ones Preston had called cute and a nice hobby. He'd photographed them, digitized them, and presented them to his corporate clients as original branding concepts. The evidence was damning. Emails to clients describing his creative vision, invoices billing for original conceptual design. Work. He'd even won an award from the Marketing Association of New York for innovative visual identity creation. Award sat on his desk, gold and gleaming. Built entirely on her stolen work, Delilah had confronted him exactly once. His response had been dismissive and cruel. "We're never going to do anything with them," he'd said, barely looking up from his phone. "They were just sitting in your studio collecting dust. I turned them into something valuable. You should be thanking me." She'd wanted to fight. She'd wanted to drag him through court, expose him, make him pay for what he'd stolen. But her lawyer had been blunt. Preston had resources, connections, and a firm full of attorneys who would bury her in litigation for years. She'd be broke before she ever saw justice. So Delilah had made a different choice. She'd walked away with what little the divorce settlement provided, and she'd started over. The rebirth the first 6 months had been brutal. Delilah rented a tiny studio apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors. Conversations through the walls, and the radiator clanged like a prison riot. She'd taken freelance graphic design work, the kind of soul-crushing corporate projects that paid the bills but killed creativity. But at night, after the freelance work was done, Delilah returned to her true passion. She'd always been fascinated by the intersection of traditional art and technology. Now, with nothing left to lose, she dove in completely. She taught herself 3D modeling software. She learned projection mapping and interactive design. She experimented with sensors that could make art respond to movement, to sound, to the presence of viewers. Her tiny apartment became a laboratory, filled with borrowed equipment and jury-rigged installations. Her breakthrough came at a small gallery in Bushwick. The owner, a friend from art school, had given her a corner for a pop-up exhibition. Delilah had created an immersive piece called Stolen Light. Viewers walked through hanging translucent panels that displayed fragments of images, memories, and text. As they moved, their shadows triggered projections that revealed hidden layers beneath the surface. It was personal. It was raw. It was about theft and reconstruction. It's about finding beauty in broken things. Most people walked through it politely and moved on. But one man stood in the center of the installation for 20 minutes, completely still, watching the light play across the panels. Warren Blackwell. Warren Blackwell was not a name most people knew, and that was exactly how he wanted it. While tech billionaires, like those from Silicon Valley, courted publicity and media attention, Warren had built his empire in silence. He'd made his fortune in data security and encryption in the early 2000s, sold his company for an undisclosed sum rumored to be in the billions, and disappeared from public life. What people didn't know was that Warren had spent the last 15 years becoming one of the world's most influential private art collectors and patrons. He didn't buy art to show it off. He bought it because it moved him, because it challenged him, because it represented something he believed the world needed to see. He'd been walking through the Bushwick Gallery by accident, killing time before a dinner meeting, when he'd encountered Stolen Light. After 20 minutes of silence, he'd approached Delilah, who was nervously adjusting a projector in the corner. "This is extraordinary," he'd said simply. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried absolute authority. "Tell me about it." Delilah had been so startled she'd nearly dropped the projector. The man standing before her was in his late 50s, with silver hair, sharp gray eyes, and an understated elegance that spoke of real wealth rather than the desperate displays of it. He wore a simple black sweater and dark jeans, but everything about him suggested power. She'd told him everything. About the concept of reconstruction, about finding beauty in fragments, about the way trauma could be transformed into something meaningful. She hadn't told him about Preston, not specifically, but Warren was perceptive enough to read between the lines. "I'd like to commission a piece," Warren had said when she finished. "Something larger. something that could fill a space and transform it completely. Would you be interested? Delilah had almost laughed. She was barely making rent. I would be very interested. But I should tell you, I don't have a studio right now. Just my apartment, that Warren had said with the hint of a smile, is a problem I can solve. The project Warren's estate in Westchester was less a house and more a private compound. Sprawling grounds, multiple buildings, and a dedicated art studio that was better equipped than most universities. He'd given Delilah complete access to everything. The commission was unlike anything she'd ever attempted. Warren wanted an installation for the main gallery of his private foundation. It's a space that hosted intimate gatherings of collectors, artists, and philanthropists. The piece needed to be ambitious, immersive, and emotionally resonant. Delilah had spent 8 months creating Convergence. It was a massive installation that combined traditional painting, digital projection, artificial intelligence, and interactive elements. Viewers walk through a space where classical oil paintings overlaid with digital elements that responded to their presence. The AI learned from each interaction, slowly evolving the piece over time so that it was never exactly the same twice. The technical challenge was immense. Delilah worked with programmers, engineers, and fabricators. Warren provided every resource she needed and never once questioned her vision. He'd check in weekly, offering thoughtful feedback but never demanding changes. When Convergence was finally unveiled at a private event for Warren's foundation, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Collectors who'd spent decades in the art world stood in the installation with tears in their eyes. Critics who'd seen everything called it a revolution in contemporary art. Offers started pouring in before the night was over. Warren had found Delilah the next morning, sitting exhausted in the studio, staring at the sketches and plans that covered every wall. "You did something remarkable," he'd said, handing her a cup of coffee. "I have a proposition for you." The offer Warren's foundation was expanding. He wanted to create a new division focused on supporting emerging artists who worked at the intersection of technology and traditional media. He needed someone to lead it, someone who understood both the artistic vision and the technical execution, someone who could identify talent and help nurture it. He wanted Delilah to be the creative director. The salary was more than she'd made in 5 years of marriage to Preston. The resources were unlimited. The opportunity was everything she'd ever dreamed of. "Why me?" Delilah had asked, overwhelmed. "Because you understand what it means to build something from nothing," Warren had said. "Because you've been dismissed and underestimated, and you did the work anyway. Because when you talk about art, you don't talk about investment value or market trends. You talk about meaning. That's what I need." Delilah had accepted on the spot. Over the next 18 months, she'd transformed herself completely. Not in the superficial way Amber had, with designer clothes and calculated appearances, but in a fundamental shift of identity and purpose. She was no longer someone's ex-wife or someone's failed artist. She was Delilah Brooks, creative director of the Blackwell Foundation. One of the most respected voices in contemporary art, she'd overseen the creation of 3 major installations that had been featured in international publications. She'd discovered and funded 12 emerging artists who were now making waves in galleries from New York to Tokyo. She'd spoken at conferences, been interviewed for art journals, quietly built a reputation among people who actually mattered in her field. The transformation wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. She was taking back everything Preston had tried to steal from her: her confidence, her talent, her future. The invitation to the Hamptons yacht party had arrived 3 weeks ago. It was for an exclusive gathering of collectors, investors, and cultural influencers, hosted at a private estate overlooking the water. Warren had been invited, of course, and he'd asked Delilah to accompany him. "It's partially social, partially business," Warren had explained. "There are several collectors I want you to meet, people who could fund the next phase of the foundation. Plus, it'll be a beautiful weekend. You deserve a break." Delilah had almost declined. The Hamptons felt like Preston's world, not hers. But then she'd seen the guest list. Preston Walsh and his wife Amber were attending. He'd apparently made some connections with one of the hosts, a real estate mogul with ties to the legal world. Something cold and clear had settled in Delilah's chest. She'd accepted the invitation now, sitting in the back of Warren's private car as they drove toward the Hamptons estate. Delilah felt surprisingly calm. She wore a midnight blue silk dress that had been custom-made for her by a designer Warren had introduced her to. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo. Diamond earrings, a loan from Warren's collection, caught the late afternoon light. "Nervous?" Warren asked, glancing up from his tablet. "No," Delilah said honestly. "I'm ready." The estate, the Hamptons estate, was exactly the kind of place Preston would love. Ostentatious, expensive, and designed to impress. The main house was a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel, perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The grounds sprawled across 15 acres, with manicured gardens, a tennis court, and a private dock where several yachts were moored. Guests were arriving in luxury cars, dressed in summer elegance. Delilah could see them through the car window, women in flowing dresses and oversized sunglasses, men in linen suits and expensive watches. It was a performance of wealth. Everyone was playing their part. Warren's car bypassed the main entrance and drove directly to a private cottage on the eastern edge of the property. It was reserved for VIP guests, a separate building with its own entrance and amenities. "Your suite is on the second floor," Warren said as they stepped out of the car. "The party starts in 2 hours. No pressure, but if you're feeling up to it, I'd love to introduce you to some people." Delilah smiled. "I'll be there." She spent the next hour getting ready, not rushing, not anxious. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone she recognized but had thought was lost. The woman she'd been before Preston. Before the marriage, before she'd allowed someone else to define her worth, that woman was back. And she was ready to face her past, the golden hour. The golden hour. The yacht party had reached that perfect moment of early evening when the summer sun hung low over the Atlantic, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The main yacht, a 200-foot masterpiece called Meridian, was anchored just offshore. Accessible by a tender service that shuttled guests back and forth from the private dock, Preston Walsh stood on the upper deck of the Meridian, a glass of scotch in his hand, feeling like he'd finally arrived. The past 2 years had been good to him. The promotion to senior partner, the marriage to Amber, the connections he'd made with clients who operated at levels he'd only dreamed about. This party was confirmation that he belonged in this world. Amber was holding court near the bow, surrounded by 3 men who were clearly captivated by her. She wore a white bikini top under a sheer cover-up that left little to the imagination, and her laughter carried across the deck like wind chimes. Preston didn't mind. Let her flirt. It was good for business. Men with money liked beautiful women, and Amber was very good at being beautiful. "Walsh, right?" A man approached, extending his hand. He was in his 60s, deeply tanned, with the kind of casual confidence that came from generational wealth. "Richard Pemberton. We met briefly at the Waldorf event last month." Preston shook his hand firmly. Pemberton was a real estate developer who'd built half of Manhattan's luxury high-rises. "Of course, Mr. Pemberton. Good to see you again. Call me Richard. I wanted to follow up on that conversation we had about corporate structuring. My team is looking into some new acquisition strategies, and I think your firm might be a good fit." Preston's heart rate quickened. This was it. This was the kind of client who could make his career. "I'd be very interested in discussing that. Why don't I have my assistant set up a meeting for next week?" "Perfect." Pemberton glanced toward the dock where another tender was approaching. "Looks like more guests are arriving. Should be quite an evening." The arrival, the murmur of conversation on the Meridian shifted, a ripple of attention moving through the crowd. Guests were turning toward the dock, where a new vessel was approaching. But this wasn't one of the standard tenders. This was something else entirely. A sleek black yacht, smaller than the Meridian but infinitely more elegant, was gliding toward the private dock. It was the kind of vessel that didn't need to be large to announce its importance. Everything about it whispered exclusivity and taste, the minimalist design, the perfect lines, the way it moved through the water with barely a sound. "That's the Circe," someone near Preston said in an awed whisper. "I heard Warren Blackwell was coming, but I didn't actually believe it." Preston's attention sharpened. Warren Blackwell. He'd heard the name, of course. Everyone in finance and law had heard of the man who'd built a tech empire and then vanished into private life. Blackwell was a legend, the kind of person who operated at levels so far above Preston's world that they might as well be mythical. The black yacht docked smoothly. A crew member secured the lines and extended a gangway. And then Warren Blackwell stepped onto the dock. He looked exactly like the few photos Preston had seen. Silver hair, sharp features, understated elegance in dark slacks, and a white linen shirt. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never had to prove himself to anyone. But it was the woman who followed him that made Preston's Scotch glass slip slightly in his hand. Recognition. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that caught the evening light, elegant and perfectly tailored. Her hair was swept up, revealing a graceful neck and the diamond earrings that sparkled at her ears. She moved with a poise and confidence that seemed to create its own gravity. Drawing every eye on the dock, Preston stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. The woman looked familiar, but it couldn't be. It was impossible. And then she turned her head, her profile catching the golden light, and Preston's world tilted on its axis. It was Delilah, his ex-wife, the woman he'd humiliated in that restaurant just days ago, the woman he'd offered a secretarial position to out of pity. She was stepping off Warren Blackwell's private yacht, walking beside one of the most powerful men in the world, like she belonged there. Oh my God, Amber's voice came from behind him, sharp with shock. She'd seen it too. Is that her? Is that your ex? Preston couldn't answer. His throat had closed up. He watched as Warren said something to Delilah, gesturing toward the Meridian. She smiled, a genuine warm expression that Preston suddenly realized he'd never seen during their marriage, and nodded. They were walking toward the tender that would bring them to the main yacht. They were coming here. The introduction, Richard Pemberton, had left. Preston sighed and was making his way eagerly toward the dock to greet Warren. Preston watched, frozen, as other guests did the same. Within moments, Warren and Delilah were surrounded by the party's most influential attendees, all of them vying for the billionaire's attention. Warren Pemberton said warmly, shaking his hand, "I'm so glad you could make it. It's been too long, Richard. Good to see you." Warren's voice was warm but measured. He turned slightly, placing a gentle hand on Delilah's back. "I'd like you to meet Delilah Brooks. She's the creative director of the Blackwell Foundation." Creative director? The words hit Preston like a physical blow. Pemberton's face lit up with recognition. Ms. Brooks. Of course. I saw Convergence last month at Warren's foundation. It was extraordinary. Genuinely one of the most moving pieces I've experienced in years. Thank you, Delilah said, her voice steady and confident. That's very kind. My wife has been pestering me to commission something for our home in Aspen, Pemberton continued. I'd love to discuss a potential project if you have time this weekend. I'd be happy to, Delilah replied graciously. Preston felt like he was watching a play in a language he didn't understand. This couldn't be the same woman who'd sat in that restaurant, quietly enduring his condescension. This couldn't be the woman whose little paintings he'd mocked. The group began moving toward the tender, heading for the Meridian. Warren and Delilah would be joining the party on the main yacht. They would be here in Preston's space, in his moment of triumph. Except it wasn't his moment anymore. The reckoning. Tender delivered Warren and Delilah to the Meridian's lower deck. Preston watched from above as the host of the party, a hedge fund manager named Gregory Sutton, personally greeted them. The deference in Sutton's manner was unmistakable. This wasn't how you greeted just any guest. This was how you greeted royalty. Amber had materialized beside Preston. Her earlier flirtatious mood completely evaporated. What is happening? She hissed. How is she here? How does she know Warren Blackwell? I don't know, Preston managed to say. Well, fix this, Amber snapped. This is humiliating. People are going to remember that restaurant. They're going to remember what you said to her. As if summoned by Amber's fears, Delilah and Warren made their way to the upper deck. The crowd parted naturally, making space for them. Preston found himself face to face with his ex-wife for the second time in a week, but under circumstances he couldn't have imagined. Preston, Delilah said, her voice neutral. What a surprise. Up close, the transformation was even more striking. She wasn't just dressed well. She carried herself differently, moved differently, spoke differently. This was a woman who knew her own worth, Delilah, Preston said, and his voice came out strained. I didn't know you'd be here. Life is full of surprises, she replied calmly. Warren was watching this exchange with interest, his sharp eyes moving between Preston and Delilah. You two know each other? We were married, Delilah said simply. A lifetime ago? Ah, Warren's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps. Or assessment. Amber pushed forward, her smile fixed and brittle. I'm Amber Walsh, Preston's wife. It's so lovely to meet you, Mr. Blackwell. And Delilah, what a transformation. You look so different from the other day. The reminder of the restaurant encounter hung in the air like smoke. Several nearby guests had gone quiet, sensing drama. Thank you, Amber, Delilah said graciously. You look lovely as well. Before Amber could respond, Richard Pemberton rejoined the group, accompanied by another man Preston recognized with a sinking feeling. It was Harold Chen, the managing partner of Preston's law firm. Warren, Delilah, Chen said, shaking their hands. I'm so glad I caught you. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from last month about the foundation's legal structuring. Preston's mind reeled. Harold Chen, his boss, had been having conversations with Delilah about legal work. The Blackwell Foundation was a client? Of course, Harold Warren said. Delilah has been leading that project. She can fill you in on where we are the next 10 minutes. Preston stood frozen as he watched Delilah discuss complex legal and financial structures with his boss and several other high-powered attorneys. She spoke with authority and precision, referencing case law and precedent with ease. She was operating at a level Preston had spent his entire career trying to reach, and she made it look effortless. The truth emerges, you know, Richard Pemberton said conversationally. Accepting a fresh drink from a passing server, it's funny you two were married. Delilah, didn't you mention that your ex-husband worked in corporate law? Delilah's expression remained neutral. Yes, he did. Small world, Pemberton continued. Because I've been meaning to ask you about something. That installation of yours, Convergence, it reminded me of some branding materials I saw a few years ago. Beautiful visual identity work for a tech startup. The aesthetic was remarkably similar. Same use of layered imagery and fragmented light. Preston's blood turned to ice. Really? Warren's voice had taken on a sharper edge. What company was this? Oh, what was the name? Pemberton frowned, thinking. Dataflow Solutions. They did cloud-based data management. The branding was exceptional. I remember it because the designer won some kind of award for it. Harold Chen's expression had shifted from polite interest to something more alert. Preston, wasn't that one of your projects? I remember you won the Marketing Association Award for that campaign. The attention of everyone in the group swung toward Preston like a spotlight. He felt sweat beginning to form on his back, despite the cool ocean breeze. Yes. I worked on that project, Preston said carefully. The thing is, Pemberton continued, oblivious to the tension he was creating, the aesthetic was so similar to your work, Delilah. The same visual language. The layered compositions, the use of shadow and light. It was almost like the same artist created both. Delilah said nothing. She simply stood there, her expression serene, letting the implication hang in the air. Warren was no longer looking at Delilah. He was looking at Preston with the kind of focused intensity that had built a billion-dollar empire. That is interesting, he said quietly. Harold Chen had gone very still. As the managing partner of a law firm, he understood exactly what was being suggested. Intellectual property theft was a career-ending offense, especially if it could be proven. Preston, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, Preston said quickly, his voice too loud. I created those designs. Delilah and I were married at the time. We collaborated. It was joint work. Actually, Delilah said, speaking for the first time in several minutes, her voice calm and clear, We never collaborated. I created mixed media pieces in my home studio. You told me they were cute hobbies. I didn't know you'd photograph them, digitize them, presented them to your clients as original work until after our divorce. The words fell like stones. The small group had grown larger, other guests drawn by the increasingly tense conversation. That's not true, Preston said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're misremembering. We talked about those projects, did we? Delilah pulled out her phone, scrolled for a moment, and held it up. Because I have the original pieces. All of them. With timestamps from my digital camera showing they were created 2 to 3 months before you presented those original designs to your clients. I also have your emails to Dataflow Solutions describing your creative vision, which is remarkably detailed for work you claimed we collaborated on, but somehow never mentioned to me. Preston's world was collapsing in real time. Harold Chin's face had gone from concern to cold anger. The other attorneys in the group were exchanging significant looks. In their world, this kind of theft wasn't just unethical. It was disbarment-worthy. Delilah, Warren said quietly, did you bring this information to Preston's firm during the divorce? No, Delilah said. My lawyer advised that fighting it would cost more than I had, and that Preston's firm would bury me in litigation. So I walked away. I decided it was better to rebuild than to spend years in court. That, Warren said, his voice like steel, was a mistake on your lawyer's part. Harold, I assume your firm has policies about intellectual property theft? Harold Chen's expression was murderous. We have very strict policies. If this is true, it would be grounds for immediate termination and referral to the Bar Association. It's not true, Preston tried again, but his voice was desperate now. She's exaggerating. She's bitter about the divorce. Am I? Delilah asked calmly. She turned to Pemberton. Richard, you mentioned Dataflow Solutions. Do you happen to know the CEO? Sure, Thomas Yang. Nice guy. Why? Would you mind calling him? I'd like to ask him a question. Pemberton looked confused but intrigued. He pulled out his phone and made the call, putting it on speaker. After a few rings, a man's voice answered, Richard, how are you? Good, Thomas. Listen, I'm here with some people, and we're discussing your brand identity from a few years ago. The visual design work. Do you remember who you worked with on that? Of course, Yang's voice came through clearly. Preston Walsh, from Jennings and Croft. He presented the designs as his original work. Very talented guy. We were impressed. And did he ever mention a collaborator or inspiration for those designs? Delilah asked, leaning toward the phone. There was a pause. No, never. He said it was all his creative vision. Why, is something wrong? Nothing wrong, Pemberton said quickly. Thanks, Thomas. He ended the call. The silence that followed was devastating. The fall Harold Chen turned to Preston, and his face was a mask of professional fury. My office. Monday morning, 9 a.m., and bring your lawyer. Harold, please, Preston began, but his boss held up a hand. Not another word. Not here, not now. He turned to Delilah, his expression transforming into one of professional contrition. Ms. Brooks, on behalf of Jennings and Croft, I apologize. If these allegations are substantiated, and it appears they will be, appropriate action will be taken immediately. Amber had been watching this entire exchange in horror. She'd gone pale under her tan, her eyes darting between Preston and the assembled guests. The calculation in her expression was almost comical. Preston could see her doing the math. Disgraced lawyer. Potential disbarment, scandal, humiliation. She took a small, almost imperceptible step away from him. I need some air, she said abruptly, and walked away without looking back. Preston watched her go, knowing she was already mentally drafting her exit strategy. The party had essentially stopped around them. Guests were pretending to look at the ocean or examine their drinks, but everyone was listening. By tomorrow, this story would be all over Manhattan's legal and social circles. Preston stood there, completely alone on a yacht full of people. Watching his carefully constructed world disintegrate, the final word Delilah watched Preston for a long moment. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Just a kind of quiet closure, like the final page of a chapter she was ready to leave behind. "I didn't come here to ruin you, Preston," she said quietly, loud enough only for him to hear. "I came here because I was invited, because I've built something I'm proud of, because I belong here now." She paused, then added, "You could have just let it go. You could have walked past me at that restaurant and said nothing, but you had to mock me one more time. You had to prove you were better, and that's always been your problem. You can't let anything go. You can't be satisfied with what you have. You always need to feel superior to someone." Preston tried to respond, but no words came. What could he say? She was right. Warren had been standing a few feet away, giving them space, but clearly listening. Now he stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Delilah's shoulder. "Ready for dinner? Gregory has an excellent chef, and I'm starving.